It all started on an ordinary summer afternoon in June of 2014. Ryan Carter was outside flying his drone when it malfunctioned and landed in the Wilsons' backyard. He didn't expect that retrieving it would change the course of his life forever. Martha Wilson was naked by the pool, unaware of Ryan's presence. When Ryan sneaked into the yard to retrieve the drone, he saw her exposed, and instead of being horrified, he was mesmerized. Martha caught him staring, and what followed spiraled into a deadly affair that shattered lives. Martha Wilson, a 65-year-old housewife, had lived in the same suburban home for over 30 years with her husband, Henry Wilson, a retired 68-year-old police officer. Their marriage, once filled with love and passion, had become routine over the years, with Henry spending more time with old friends and Martha feeling increasingly isolated. Despite her age, Martha still maintained her youthful looks and fitness, often drawing the attention of those around her. Ryan Carter, the 19-year-old neighbor, lived just 2 doors down with his parents, a typical high school graduate uncertain of his future. What he didn't expect was that a chance encounter in the Wilsons' backyard would lead to a dangerous affair that would unravel both their lives. On June 3, 2014, when Ryan's drone unexpectedly crashed into Martha Wilson's backyard, the simple act of retrieving it became a moment that changed everything. Ryan, careful not to disturb anyone, quietly slipped into the Wilsons' yard. It was a sunny afternoon, and the bright light reflected off the pool water. As he approached, he noticed Martha by the pool, completely naked, sunbathing. She was 65, but her body was surprisingly toned for her age. The years had been kind to her, and Ryan couldn't help but stare. He paused, taking it all in, his heart racing not only from fear of being caught, but also from something else, something new. Martha, without a hint of panic or embarrassment, caught his gaze. Instead of reacting as Ryan expected, she smiled. It was a knowing smile, as if she could read the thoughts running through his head. There was a spark in that moment, an unspoken tension. Ryan, stunned, quickly grabbed his drone and left, but the image of Martha lingered in his mind long after he returned home. Over the next few days, their interactions became more intentional. Every time Ryan walked past the Wilson house, Martha would be outside, either watering her plants or simply lounging on her porch. She would wave to him, sometimes holding his gaze a little longer than was appropriate. It was subtle at first, almost innocent, but Ryan felt the pull, the unspoken invitation to something more. By mid-June, Martha invited Ryan inside. It happened one afternoon while Ryan was walking home from the store. Martha was sitting on her porch, and as he passed, she invited him in for tea. The conversation started casually, with small talk about the neighborhood and his plans after graduation. Martha was charming, more so than Ryan had expected. She wasn't like the other older women he knew. She was confident and captivating. As they talked, Martha slowly began steering the conversation towards more personal topics, how she felt about her life, her marriage, and her need for something new and exciting. Ryan found himself drawn into her world, not just because of her looks, but because of the mystery surrounding her. She seemed so different from the other women in his life, so untouchable, yet so within reach. As the days passed, their meetings became more frequent. By June 25th, Ryan was visiting her almost daily. Martha never talked much about Henry, her husband, who was often out running errands or playing golf with his old friends. The house always felt like it belonged only to her when Ryan was there, like a private space that was theirs alone. On July 1st, 2014, the affair had fully blossomed. Ryan and Martha had fallen into a routine. Every afternoon, when Henry was away, Ryan would sneak over to her house. Their meetings were secret, hidden from the world. They would spend hours together, and as they became more comfortable with one another, Ryan's feelings deepened. He was convinced that what they had was real, that despite the age gap, they were meant to be together. But Martha, while enjoying the attention, didn't share the same level of attachment. For her, Ryan was simply an escape from the dullness of her life. The excitement of having someone young and eager to please was exhilarating, but she never saw it lasting forever. Still, she encouraged him, enjoying the power she held over him. Ryan, on the other hand, became more obsessive. He would talk about how much he cared for her and how he wanted to be with her always. When Martha would talk about Henry or her life outside of their meetings, Ryan would grow tense, his jealousy bubbling to the surface. Martha noticed his growing attachment, but didn't push him away. She enjoyed the thrill of it all, Ryan's devotion, the secrecy, the feeling of being desired again. It was all part of the game for her. She never intended for it to go any further, but she never told Ryan that. She let him believe whatever he wanted to believe, knowing that, for her, it was only a temporary distraction. By mid-July, the affair had become more intense. Ryan, now infatuated with Martha, would spend hours thinking about her when they were apart, wondering when they could meet next, fantasizing about what their future together might look like. He started to believe that maybe they could be together, if only Henry were out of the picture. Martha didn't take his feelings seriously, laughing off his suggestions and reminding him, in subtle ways, that their time was limited. Yet Ryan couldn't let go. His visits became more frequent, and each time the affair grew riskier. Martha knew they were playing with fire, but she was too deep into the thrill to stop. Ryan was blinded by his obsession, unable to see that Martha wasn't as invested as he was. What started as a simple attraction had spiraled into something far more dangerous, and neither of them could predict just how deadly it would become. By August 10th, 2014, Ryan's obsession had reached a dangerous level. What had once been a thrilling secret had now grown into something much darker. His feelings for Martha had deepened to the point where he could no longer stand the thought of her being with anyone else, especially Henry. As they spent more time together, Ryan began to voice his frustrations. He would talk about how much he cared for her and how they could never truly be together as long as Henry was in the picture. Ryan's jealousy of Henry festered, and he started to press Martha on the idea of leaving her husband. At first, Martha brushed off his comments. She never really believed it could go that far. For her, Ryan was still just a toy, someone to occupy her time and make her feel alive again. She had never seriously considered leaving Henry, who had provided her with a stable, comfortable life. But as Ryan kept bringing it up, his words began to sink in. He was relentless, constantly reminding her how much better things could be if Henry wasn't around. Eventually, Ryan planted the idea of killing Henry in Martha's mind. He spoke of poisoning Henry as the easiest and least messy option, something that wouldn't raise suspicion. Martha, initially horrified by the suggestion, found herself thinking about it more and more. Ryan had made it sound so simple, and she started to wonder if maybe it could be done. By September 5th, 2014, the weight of the affair had started to crumble their once careful facade. That evening, Henry picked up Martha's phone by accident. It was an ordinary moment, but what he saw on the screen was anything but. A message from Ryan appeared, and it wasn't subtle. It detailed their plans to poison him, something Henry couldn't have anticipated. The words cut through him, not only because of the threat to his life, but because of the deep betrayal it represented. Martha, the woman he had spent decades with, was plotting against him with a boy young enough to be their son. Henry felt a wave of shock and hurt, but even in that moment, he couldn't bring himself to harm Martha. Despite everything, he still loved her. Instead, he decided to confront her directly. Later that evening, once he and Martha were alone in the house, Henry calmly approached her. He didn't yell or scream. Instead, he laid her phone on the table and asked her to explain herself. His voice was steady, but the pain was evident in his expression. Martha was caught off guard. She hadn't expected Henry to find out this way, and the realization that her secret had been uncovered left her scrambling for control. As Henry stood there waiting for an answer, Martha grew defensive. She knew there was no way to talk herself out of it, so she tried to deflect the situation. She began to scream, hoping the neighbors might hear and think Henry was doing something to her. It was a desperate attempt to make herself the victim, to create confusion. In the chaos, Henry tried to calm her down. He reached out, but in her panic, Martha stumbled. The living room was small and cluttered with furniture, and as she tried to back away, she tripped. Her head collided with the sharp edge of the coffee table, the impact immediately causing a deep cut. Blood began to flow from the wound, staining the beige carpet beneath her. For a moment, everything froze. Henry stood there, shocked, as Martha lay on the floor, the pool of blood growing larger by the second. He couldn't move. His mind raced, but he couldn't bring himself to call for help. He watched in disbelief as Martha's life slowly slipped away. The woman he had loved, the woman who had betrayed him, was dying in front of him, and he did nothing. The blood loss was severe, and within minutes, Martha was gone. Henry remained in the living room for what felt like hours, unable to process what had just happened. The room was eerily quiet, except for the faint sound of the clock ticking. He couldn't bring himself to call the police or an ambulance. He sat down, staring at Martha's lifeless body, still in shock. The confrontation had gone so wrong, so quickly. It wasn't until later that night that the reality of the situation began to sink in. But by then, it was too late to change anything. Martha was dead, and Henry knew there would be consequences for what had just occurred. The life they had built together, however flawed, was now over, shattered by betrayal, jealousy, and a moment of panic that no one could undo. On the morning of September 6th, 2014, Ryan's concern for Martha began to grow when he didn't hear from her. Normally, she would respond to his texts right away, especially on the weekends when Henry was usually out. But that day, his phone stayed silent. He tried sending several messages, checking constantly for any response, but none came. His anxiety started to build, and by the afternoon, Ryan could no longer shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't like Martha to ignore him, especially after everything they had been planning. By the evening, Ryan's worry reached its peak. He couldn't stand waiting anymore, and a feeling of dread settled over him. He feared the worst. He decided to take action and called the police, hoping they could check on Martha and see if she was all right. He didn't mention the affair, but simply said he hadn't heard from her and was worried. When the police arrived at the Wilson house later that evening, they were met with a chilling scene. Henry was still sitting in the living room, just as he had been since the night before. His face was blank, and he seemed completely detached from the world around him. Martha's lifeless body lay just a few feet away from him on the floor, a pool of dried blood beneath her head. The police quickly took control of the situation. They asked Henry what had happened, but his response was almost robotic. He kept repeating that it had been an accident, that he hadn't meant for things to go that way. By September 7th, 2014, the police launched a full investigation into Martha's death. Henry was taken into custody, though he maintained that Martha's death was unintentional. However, as they dug deeper, the officers uncovered details that complicated the case. Martha's phone, which had been lying on a nearby table, contained a series of messages that caught the attention of the investigators. Those messages revealed not only her affair with Ryan, but also a chilling conversation about poisoning Henry. The plan to murder Henry, discussed in such detail over text, painted a much darker picture than Henry's story of a simple accident. Ryan's involvement became clear almost immediately. The texts between him and Martha were damning. Investigators saw the timeline unfold, Ryan's growing obsession, his jealousy of Henry, and the dangerous plan to eliminate the man standing between him and Martha. Ryan was brought in for questioning, and though he tried to distance himself from the murder itself, the evidence was overwhelming. It was clear that he had been pushing Martha toward a dangerous solution, and he could not deny his part in the plan to poison Henry. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about the nature of the affair. Neighbors began talking about the strange interactions they had noticed between Martha and Ryan over the summer. Some had seen them together at odd times of the day, and others had heard whispers of an inappropriate relationship. The more the police uncovered, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a twisted story of betrayal, obsession, and murder. By September 20th, 2014, detectives had pieced together most of the case. They concluded that while Henry may not have intended to kill Martha that night, his actions had ultimately led to her death. The struggle in the living room, Martha's fall, and the failure to call for help had all contributed to her demise. As a result, Henry was charged with involuntary manslaughter. He hadn't planned to kill her, but the confrontation had spiraled out of control, and his inaction in those critical moments sealed her fate. Ryan, on the other hand, faced much harsher charges. The messages between him and Martha were undeniable evidence of his role in the attempted murder of Henry. His constant pressure on Martha to leave Henry, combined with the sinister plot to poison him, left no room for doubt. Ryan was charged with attempted murder for his involvement in the plot to take Henry's life. The media quickly picked up on the story, and by late September, it was making headlines across the state. The shocking age gap between Martha and Ryan only added to the scandal. People couldn't believe that a 65-year-old housewife had engaged in such a dangerous affair with a 19-year-old boy next door. The case had all the elements of a media sensation: infidelity, murder, and a deadly plot to eliminate an unsuspecting husband. As the news spread, the neighborhood was left in shock. Those who had known the Wilsons for years couldn't fathom how things had gone so wrong. Martha had always been seen as a respectable woman, and Henry, a retired officer, had been well liked in the community. But now the truth was out, and it painted a much darker picture of the seemingly ordinary couple. By the time the case went to trial, both Henry and Ryan were the center of attention. Henry's defense focused on the fact that he had never intended to kill Martha, while Ryan's involvement in the murder plot was laid bare for the court to see. In the end, both men would face the consequences of their actions, though their sentences reflected the differences in their roles. Henry, despite his inaction during Martha's fatal fall, was portrayed by his defense as a man pushed to the edge by betrayal. His legal team focused on how he had discovered his wife's affair, the disturbing text messages plotting his murder, and the shock of confronting Martha that night. The prosecution, however, highlighted his failure to call for help as Martha lay bleeding. While they acknowledged that the death was unintentional, they argued that Henry had still contributed to her death through his negligence. On October 15, 2014, Henry was sentenced to 8 months in prison for involuntary manslaughter. The judge took into account his lack of intent to harm Martha and his cooperation with the investigation, but he couldn't ignore the fact that Henry had let her die without doing anything to help her. For Henry, the short sentence was still a crushing blow. He had lost his wife, his reputation, and now his freedom, even if only for a brief time. Ryan, on the other hand, faced a much more severe outcome. The court had little sympathy for him. His role in the attempted murder of Henry was undeniable, and the prosecution painted him as a dangerous young man, driven by jealousy and obsession. The messages between him and Martha, detailing their plan to poison Henry, left no doubt that Ryan had been a willing participant in the conspiracy. His obsession with Martha, despite her using him as little more than a thrill, had led him down a path of destruction. On November 10, 2014, Ryan was sentenced to 7 years in prison for attempted murder. The court acknowledged his age, but emphasized the seriousness of his actions. The judge pointed out that Ryan had not only engaged in an illicit affair, but had actively encouraged Martha to kill her husband. His obsession had blinded him to the reality of the situation, and now he would have to pay the price. The media continued to cover the case throughout the trial, drawing attention to the scandalous details: the affair between an elderly woman and a teenager, the murder plot, and the tragic end that left Martha dead on her living room floor. As the story spread, the neighborhood where Martha and Henry had once lived became a symbol of how even the quietest communities could harbor dark secrets. By the time December 1st, 2014 arrived, both Henry and Ryan were behind bars, and the case that had once gripped the media began to fade from the public's attention. The aftermath of the tragedy left lasting scars. Henry, despite his brief sentence, would never fully recover from the loss of his wife and the damage to his reputation. When he was released from prison, he moved out of the neighborhood, unable to face the memories of what had happened. Ryan's life, too, was irrevocably changed. His youthful obsession with Martha had led him down a path he never expected, and now he was forced to confront the reality of what he had done. 7 years in prison would give him plenty of time to reflect on the choices he had made. But by the time he was released, his life would be unrecognizable. This case reveals how quickly an innocent fascination can spiral into deadly obsession. Ryan's infatuation with Martha led him down a path he never imagined, while Martha's attempt to use him as a temporary thrill cost her everything. What happens when a boy's admiration for an older woman goes too far? For more, check out the story of another deadly affair, where husband discovers wife's secret affair with neighbor's teenage son, and it ends in murder. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates.